Good morning, everybody. My name is Liam Herlihy, Chair of Teagasc, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our National Dairy Conference here this morning. I don't have to remind you that we are looking forward to meeting you in person in Rochestown Park Hotel this morning, but unfortunately, because of COVID issues, that wasn't possible, and I sincerely hope that you will appreciate that having this conference by virtual means is the right course of action. This morning we have a very busy agenda, busy itinerary, lots of very important guest speakers. The theme of our conference this morning is Meeting Climate Obligations, a Pathway for the Dairy Industry. And I believe the operative word here is pathway. I don't have to remind you that in recent times we've heard a great deal about the whole area of climate change, which we must all embrace, irrespective of our backgrounds, age, or occupation. Equally, from a farming point of view, what is important, of course, is that we have the recent sectorial targets for agriculture have been announced. I think what's important here is that we must embrace this with a sense of positivity, as agriculture always did in the past. While those targets are, to put it mildly, are very, very challenging. With the advancement of science and the implementation of technology, those targets can be achievable. And I think that is something that is very important, that we pursue this from a positive perspective, or as I would say, to pursue it from the background of having the glass half full. In dealing with those changes, Teagasc today, I believe, has a more important role now than ever before. We are a science-based organisation, have been, and are investing significantly, both in laboratory, but most of all, in our people, to bring about technologies that will ensure that agriculture, our farmers, and the industry will continue to have both a productive and fulfilling career in agriculture, and at the same time, meeting those climate targets. Our opening speaker this morning will be our recently appointed director, Professor Frank O'Mara. Frank needs very little introduction because over the past 12 years, he has been research director in Teagasc. During that period of time, he and his team have been responsible for bringing about many of the technologies that are being implemented in our farms today. And he, along with his team, are absolutely committed to developing new technologies for all of us farmers to implement, to make sure that the pathway that we are now embarking on can be achieved in a productive and positive way. Before I hand you over to Professor O'Mara, it is important that your audience today will be fully engaged and fully participated with us. And you would have the opportunity of asking whatever question you would like to ask through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And at the end of Professor O'Mara's presentation, I will have the opportunity of putting those to Frank on your behalf. So with that, Frank, Professor O'Mara, over to you.
Thanks very much, Chairman. And as you probably can hear, everybody, I'm a little bit croaky this morning, so please bear with me as I get through the talk. So look, I'm just going to share my screen here with the slides. Hopefully you can see that now. So as the Chairman said, what we're talking about today is meeting our climate obligations and setting out the pathway for the dairy industry. But before we talk about the pathway for the industry, let's just look at the background to how we got here. So in the formation of the new government, a target was set that we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the country by 51% by 2030. And that target has been written into legislation in what's called the new Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Amendment Bill. And that really is a very ambitious target. It happens to be quite similar to the target that the EU has also set earlier this year, the EU brought out what it calls the Fit for 55 package, and that's targeting a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030. So I suppose we're all bamboozled with targets over the last couple of weeks. It's been really wall-to-wall coverage between the Irish targets and the COP. But I suppose we also have to bear in mind that it's not just about the legislation aspects and the targets and the what we have to do. Actually, society at large does see this as a very important issue. So dealing with climate change is central to our license to farm. And it's also, we are told, very important in the markets where we sell our produce. So just looking at the sectorial targets that were introduced by the government in the last couple of weeks in the Climate Action Plan. And these are the percent reduction required by 2030, with 2018 set as the baseline. So the overall target is a 51% reduction. And the economy then is broken up into various sectors, each of which has its own emissions target. So we've all probably heard that the target for agriculture is somewhere between a 22 and a 30% reduction. And you can see that that's actually the lowest target of any of the sectors of the economy. Transport, home heating, industry, all got targets in the range of about 40 to 50%, maybe a little bit lower for industry. The sector that got the really heavy target to meet is the electricity generation target. So all these targets are actually going to be very difficult for all the sectors to meet. We all are well aware of the challenges of renewable energy for the last couple of months, with the fact that the wind hasn't been blown very much, and also the fact that we're going to need a lot more electricity for the next decade as we switch to electric cars and switch home heating to electricity. So none of these targets are going to be easy. And the same goes for the agriculture target, even if it is the lowest. In terms of what that actually means, our emissions in 2018 from agriculture were 23 million tons of CO2. And to get that 22 to 30% reduction, they have to reduce to 16 to 18 million tons by 2030. We also have this sector over here that we may come back to talk about. It's called land use change and forestry. And this is the sector where forestry, sequestration, and emissions from bogs and so on are counted. And that sector, just to note that it's separate from agriculture in the way it's set up at the moment, and that sector also has a target to reduce emissions. How have agricultural greenhouse gas emissions changed over the last 30 years? Well, I suppose overall, there hasn't been a huge amount of change in them. They've hovered around the 20 million tons or maybe slightly above it for most of that period. And while they declined up to about 2008 or so, 2009, they have more or less been rising since around 2010 as the cattle herd started to expand. If we look at a typical dairy farm, most of the emissions on that farm will come from methane. And that's driven by the number of animals, the number of cows or other cattle on the farm. The other big source of emissions is the amount of nitrogen fertilizer used. And that releases a greenhouse gas called nitrous oxide. And the third source of emissions on a dairy farm is methane and nitrous oxide from slurry or animal manures, even if those manures are produced directly at pasture. So if we were to break up the emissions overall, about 70% of a dairy farm emissions would come from methane, about 23% from nitrous oxide, and the remaining 7% is carbon dioxide, which comes mainly from fuel and electricity use on the farm. So you can see that the dominant gas on a dairy farm, or indeed a beef farm, is methane, with nitrous oxide being the second one. So because emissions are so closely related to the number of animals and the amount of fertilizer used, there have been a lot of calls from people that, to reach our targets, we'll need to reduce the cattle herd. Well, I suppose we see that there's a pathway other than that, and that's what we want to explore now. So what can agriculture do immediately to reduce emissions? Well, the two big things that any farmer can do is look at efficiency on the farm and look at the technologies that are available to reduce emissions. And Teagasc has been working on these for the last decade or more. to see how can efficiency contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and what technologies are available to supplement the efficiency. And these efficiency measures and technologies have all been described in the Teagasc MAC curve, or marginal abatement cost curve, that you may have heard about. For the next couple of years, the big focus is going to be on nitrogen and nitrous oxide emissions, because methane is hard to mitigate now. Some of the measures that we talk about, in particular when we look at measures to reduce emissions from land or to increase sequestration, there's actually costs associated with those, so incentives quite probably will be required. And I suppose the other aspect that we think is very important is that the whole industry needs to work together in relation to this. Farmers, food processors, the co-ops, the meat companies, input suppliers, ourselves in Teagasc, other state agencies and the department. We can really only achieve the progress that we need to achieve by adopting a team approach to this. So in terms of those efficiency measures and technologies, just what exactly are they? And this is a simple diagram explaining what are the things that are important for a farmer to be considering on a farm now. And the first would be to improve EBI and to improve grassland management and try to extend the grazing season. A really important one is the role of clover in that, because any way that we can take nitrogen, fertilizer, chemical nitrogen out of the system is very positive for greenhouse gas emissions. So for the residual nitrogen fertilizer that you need to use, protected urea is the type of fertilizer of choice because it is the lowest emissions. Obviously, slurry, as I showed earlier, is a source of emissions, so reducing the losses and, importantly, getting the best nutrient value from your slurry is really important. Improving energy efficiency, trying to save energy around the milking parlour or with lighting or so on, is very important, and also the possibilities around renewable energy. Forestry, hedgerows, they're very important as well as part of the national picture to getting to our climate targets. And finally, when we look at sustainability in a holistic manner, water quality is also very important. And a lot of the measures that contribute to reducing emissions will also help to improve water quality. So just to look at how we might get to 2030 and what is the roadmap as we see it. And as I said, we need to reduce emissions by 5 to 7 million tonnes. That's starting from a picture where overall emissions from agriculture are about 23 million tonnes. So by 2030, the target is to have those emissions down to between 16 and 18 million tonnes. So the type of efficiency measures and technologies that are contained in the Teagasc MAC that I just talked about on the last slide, if all of those were implemented at the kind of levels that we think is feasible by 2030, that would reduce emissions from the sector by about 2 million tonnes. So a very sizable contribution, but still not going to give us the 5 to 7 million tonnes that's needed. So we have obviously been working away at other measures that might reduce emissions over the last number of years since we published the MAC. So these are measures that are almost ready, but are not yet in the MAC because the research isn't completed. And these are things like feed additives, and you probably have heard a lot about things like seaweed or feed supplements that can reduce methane. And some of those are at fairly early stage of research, but some are at the end point of the research, and we think they'll be available on the market in the next year or two. We're also looking at other fertilizer formulations as well as protected urea. And a measure that has great potential is to see, can we get to the target slaughter weight of beef cattle at an earlier age? And all those technologies that are almost ready, or in the case of earlier slaughter, are ready to deploy on farms. They would get us somewhere between 1 to 1.5 million tonnes, or if you were quite ambitious in your targets for earlier slaughter, you might get that to about 2 million tonnes of CO2. So you add that to the 2 million from the measures that are in the MAC, and that gets you to about 4 million tonnes, which is quite a long way along the road, but still not at the 5 to 7 million tonnes that will be needed to reach the targets. So there are a number of quite promising technologies at a very early stage of research that we hope will come to fruition over the next decade. And there are things like feed additives that could be used at pasture, or breeding animals that are low emitters. And we think that they are very promising. And if they come to fruition over the next decade, they can deliver somewhere maybe between 1.5 and 3 million tons of CO2. And that would allow us to get to our targets of 16 to 18 million tons and put us on the pathway to being a climate neutral agriculture sector by 2050. So I suppose the message we have here is that there is a pathway to reach our targets without a need to cut the national herd. It's not a straightforward pathway. It's challenging. It requires action on every farm in the country. It requires a lot of successful research to be completed over that time. But that pathway is there, and that's the pathway that we will be urging farmers to follow over the coming decade. There are also opportunities in terms of the sequestration side of the equation. And this is what, is commonly called carbon farming. And can we sequester carbon in our mineral soils, in forestry, in hedgerows? Yes, there are opportunities there. There's also quite a lot of emissions that come from peat soils, including drained grassland peats. And we can reduce those emissions by managing the water table. There's a lot of research needed in that area, but again, there are opportunities. On every farm, there are opportunities to reduce electricity and diesel usage. And that not only saves money, but can also contribute to meeting the fuel and energy targets for the country. And there are opportunities, particularly on dairy farms, to use solar energy to contribute to your energy needs, and also to sell, hopefully in the very near future, to sell solar energy back into the national grid. And my colleagues will talk about that in some of the later talks as part of this virtual conference. I suppose importantly, while those opportunities are there and will be very important, they're separate in the agricultural targets to reduce emissions by 5 to 7 million tons. We have to achieve that reduction target by reducing emissions rather than relying on sequestration. But nevertheless, those opportunities in sequestration are very important for the post-2030 period. So finally, to finish up, what will Teagasc do over the next decade? Well, we'll obviously continue to work with you to support your livelihoods in dairy farming. We will promote the pathway of technology and efficiency, and that will be a priority for our advisory services, as illustrated through the Signpost programme, which we have rolled out earlier this year. We will accelerate research into new technologies. As part of that, we will review very carefully all the calculations of emissions and sequestration. We will ensure that whatever new technologies are developed can get counted in the inventory. And we will support diversification opportunities such as organics where farmers wish to avail of those opportunities. And I suppose overall, we want to work with you and with others to develop a pathway to 2030 and beyond so that we can reach the targets and put ourselves on our road to climate neutrality by 2050. So thank you very much.
O'Mara, I have a few questions here that a few people have sent on to me. I've one question here is asked by both a Pat and a Margaret, and it is, what level of uptake is needed on farms to achieve those targets that you were speaking about?
Okay, a very good question. So for each of the measures that we have outlined, we also have a target for uptake. So if you take the protected urea, our target is that 65% of straight nitrogen would be protected urea by 2030, and that we achieve that more or less in 5 to 6% steps every year. For something like low emission slurry spreading, the target is that all slurry produced on farms in derogation is going to be spread that way, and that I think 90% of overall slurry produced in the country is spread by low emission slurry by 2030. So for each of the measures, there's a target set in terms of adoption, which is quite ambitious.
Thanks. I have another one it's very much the same, from Brendan and Gerard. Is the stable herd size needed to meet the climate roadmap?
Yeah, look, that's a very good question, one that has got a lot of debate over the last number of weeks. And look, obviously, the more the herd grows, the more emissions will grow, and therefore the longer the pathway to getting to our targets becomes. In our calculations, we have we're working to a baseline in terms of the national herd out to 2030. And within that, we have allowed for a modest expansion of the dairy herd over that time, with a corresponding modest reduction in the suckler herd, leading to an overall stable herd over that period. And that's the way the herd size has panned out for the last 3 or 4 years. So if that continues, that we don't see a big increase in the herd, or we don't see a big growth in dairy cow numbers without that reduction in suckler cow numbers, well, look, I think the concept of a stable herd is one then that we can work with.
Thanks. And the final question, I have a question here from a lady called Phyllis. It's quite technical, but maybe to condense it, it's why are forestry and hedgerows counted as separate? Can you explain that, please, Frank?
I can. So look, there's an accounting framework that's agreed internationally for how all these emissions are counted and reported. And in that, what's called the land use and land use change in forestry are considered as a separate sector. And it's like, so that's where your sequestration and your forestry are included in that sector. It's likely that will combine with the agricultural sector after 2030, but for the moment, that's a separate sector. And what it means is that the emissions reduction targets that we have, this 22 to 30%, has to be met by actual emissions reductions. We can't use the sequestration to substitute for that. That's not to say that the sequestration isn't important, and I think the government will be very anxious to promote both forestry and sequestration in soils and hedgerows as measures to contribute to the overall national target in the run-up to 2030.
Okay, thanks, Professor O'Mara. With that, I will hand you over to Emma Louise Coffey, who will act as moderator and introduce the panel for the next session. Emma Louise, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. You're very welcome to the first discussion of the Teagasc National Dairy Conference. In this session, we're going to tackle the topic of the future direction of the dairy breeding programme here in Ireland. My name is Emma Louise, as the Chair has said, and I will moderate today's session with a distinguished panel, dairy farmer Jim White from Mullinahone in County Tipperary, and Teagasc researchers Donagh Berry, Stephen Butler and Nicky Byrne. We will have a brief chat with Jim, and then we will have a short presentation from each of our panel members. Please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to get any questions or comments that you may have for any of our panel members. Just to start with you, Jim, you're here today representing your discussion group, the Kildalton discussion group. I suppose firstly, if you could give us some insight into the discussion group.
Okay, Emma Louise, we're a discussion group that was formed out of the college in Kildalton over 20 years ago. And we straddled counties Tipperary, Waterford, Kilkenny, Wexford, Carlow and Laois. And we have a diverse lot of farmers in that group. But one thing that would really bring us together in the group is our single-minded focus on genetic gain leading to better profits. And that's one thing that really keeps us together over the years and drives on our farms.
And looking to breeding, what in particular have you focused on over the last decade?
Well, we've focused on milk solids and fertility, and they're things that we can put our hands on now and look back and see where we've come from. And if we go back 10 years ago, the milk solids produced per cow in our group was 359 kgs per cow. And that has risen steadily over the years to an impressive 474 kgs now. That's 115 euros gain over the period. But if we look at that time span, quotas went in 2015. So we could take out 2014 and 2018 with the drought. And those 2 years counted for 39 kgs of milk solids. But that still leaves us with 76 kgs of milk solids per cow that we've gained. And that's something that is a massive increase to our farms. And it's something that, genetics has delivered. If we look at our meal feeding in the period, our meal feeding stayed practically the same. We're still feeding about 750 kgs of meal per cow. So we see the 76 kgs of milk solids as a real figure that we have got through better breeding, longer lactation.
And I think if we put some numbers on that, you mentioned 115 kilos per cow at 4 kilos per kilo, €4 per kilo of milk solids. That's €460 additional profit per cow. And, you know, if we look at a roughly average herd of 100 cows, €46,000 additional profit in the year. So that is massive, and it's something measurable within your group. You mentioned fertility as well as an important focus. So can you quantify how that has evolved in the last decade?
Well, to drive the kgs of increase that we've got, you know, you need the solids, but you need the lactation, and that comes from fertility. So we look at the 6-week calving rate, and if we look back at 2012, we had a 6-week calving rate of 69% calving in that 6-week period. But that has grown over the years to a stable 85% now. And that 85% calved in 6 weeks is a little bit of sex semen being introduced in the last number of years, and we still have the 85. So that drives the long lactation, calving on time, getting the lactation in, and getting those kgs of milk solids.
And massive improvements, as you say, 69% up to a stable 85% over the last number of years, but still a little bit of room for improvement.
Always room for improvement. Yeah, that's why we look to the researchers, and I look forward to the presentation from the lads now to see where we can drive it on and get the gains for the future years ahead.
You mentioned, you know, the Dalton group across a number of counties, and, you know, a lot of cows tied up in those farms. What sort of a cow is delivering that high level of milk solids production and good fertility?
A smart answer to that is the cow that calves on time and stays calving on time. And our group has diverse opinions, diverse cows, black and white cows, Jersey cows. But the key thing is that they have solid genetics to start with. High EBI, our herd has 178 EBI average, and it has a €10 gain per lactation. We've done some work with DNA in our group, and the gain, we can see gains coming there. So our cows, you might have difference of opinion in Jerseys, black and whites, Holsteins, but one thing that brings us together is solid genetics and solid facts then to back up those genetics with results of profits.
And we're here today looking to the future of breeding. So let's put it to you, Jim. The future of breeding, where does the focus lie for the breeding season of 2022 and beyond for the Kildalton discussion group?
Well, like all groups, we're listening to Liam earlier in the introduction and Frank there. There's a pathway out for us. We know we have to reduce our methane, and our targets are set there. And, you know, there's a lot of, and the lads refer to them, projects out there that research still has to be quantified on. But the one thing we do know, milk solids, fertility, they're delivering results for us. So we need to build on them, and any add-ons we can get to them, all the better. But there are rock solid ones that we'll hold. Health will be something we will have to get better at, I think. And as farmers and as our group, we need to put more data into that to, lameness and mastitis incidents. So that will help. And milk recording is something that needs to be pushed on our group. We all milk record in the group. It goes hand in hand with good breeding. And I think a milk recording early in the year and a good number of them in for the year. And then looking to the future, we have looked in at, saleable calves on the ground. We, with a stable herd and our stocking rate stable on our farms, we will have to look at saleable calves going off. But I suppose, to repeat again, we stick with the basics that have delivered solid for us.
And we've heard that lots of times, Jim. Being best at the basics gets you a lot of the way. Thanks, Jim. We'll park it there for now. We'll now turn our attention to Donagh Berry, and Donagh is going to give us a presentation looking to the future traits that we should see included in the EBI.
Thanks, Emma Louise. And I guess if we're thinking about what traits need to be in our future breeding strategies, one of the first things we need to think about is, well, what are the grand challenges that are facing us in the near future? And we heard about some of these already. If you're watching the news over the past few weeks, COP26, it was all over the news, and the climate challenges that are going to be faced, and the ruminant or the cattle contributors to that. Of course, it's bigger than climate, it's environment. So we're talking here about nitrogen use efficiency and water quality, for example. And while much of the narrative is about the influence of cows and cattle on the environment, from a grazing perspective, what about the influence of climate and climate change on agriculture and dairy cows? Also, of course, is the social values associated with it. And from a dairying perspective, the male calf is a big issue. But we have a lot of the technologies available to us that can mitigate some of these. The diversification of products. We have Brexit ongoing at the moment. We have, particularly in the last few weeks, the Northern Ireland Protocol. What are the implications of that going to be for our markets? So the diversity of markets. Food trends, consumer trends. We're hearing a lot of these alternative juices, alternative meats, etc. But I see dairying as a complementary source to a lot of these products. And then, of course, we have the volatility in the global dairy market that is always going to exist. Now, as Liam alluded to, from a breeding perspective, certainly, it's very much a glass half full situation. So even though there's lots of technologies that have been muted that can mitigate a lot of these challenges, we know for a fact for the past 20 years that breeding has been a proven technology to deliver on some of these challenges. We just take reproductive performance, for example. That was a massive challenge 20 years ago. Yet over that period, and Jim alluded to this, we have seen massive strides in reproductive performance. There was a question earlier about uptake. You have to breed your cows. So you may as well use a good bull as use a bad bull. So again, this has one of those technologies that Frank talked about, that you have a high penetrance or high uptake level. And then, of course, there's the fact that this has to co-evolve with management. And we're going to hear a lot about clover, etc. tomorrow, but we have to identify the cow that is suitable for the most profitable system. So I just want to firstly look back at, well, what is the relative emphasis within the EBI, the Economic Breeding Index in Ireland? And this is just a graphic here with the different colours of the different traits. If we just focus on fertility and milk, for example, and Jim alluded to this as well, around 2/3 of the emphasis is on fertility and milk. Now, this is the theoretical influence. Jim again mentioned this point that emphasis on fertility is actually driving milk, but it's not just milk, it's profitable milk production. So in fact, there's a lot more emphasis on milk than what this graph would suggest. But there are a whole other traits, and what my talk is going to be about is where are the new traits going to be. And if you insert new traits into this index, what you will see is that the relative emphasis will come off the others. So you will slow down genetic gain in the other traits, but you will actually increase genetic gain in profit. Now, while I was asked to talk about the EBI, heretofore, many of us would have thought that dairy industry is in isolation, but it's not. We're now part of the cattle industry, the cattle sector. And this is why Nicky Byrne is actually talking here today, is about the beef component of the dairy industry. So what I'm showing you here is an index, the Dairy Beef Index, which we launched 2 or 3 years ago. And this is the emphasis within the traits within that Dairy Beef Index. So what we're trying to do is marry the desires of the dairy farmer here in green. So that's about 50% emphasis on dairy performance traits, easy calving, short gestation, and then 50% emphasis on the traits of interest to the beef farmer. Now, while I was asked to talk about the traits for the future of the EBI, actually it's exactly the same traits would be of interest to both of these indexes. So we're going to bring both of these indexes forward. So what are the improvements? If we talk about the indexes themselves, the EBI or the Dairy Beef Index, is the new traits. What are the new traits of the future? Can we revise the genetic evaluations? I'm not going to go into it here, but we've done a lot of extensive research over the past 2 to 3 years on improving the fertility evaluations to make them more precise. They have delivered, but we want to bring them to the next level. And then we can alter the relative weights within those traits. This, of course, is not in isolation of other things that we're doing from a breeding perspective. So the breeding scheme design, better penetrance, better uptake of AI. And Stephen Butler, for example, is going to talk about sex semen afterwards. These are all part of driving on genetic gain, but we're setting the mission statement via the breeding goal. So let's stand back from the 2 indexes and ask, well, what's missing? And I've listed out 5 of them here. Environmental efficiency. So again, everybody's talking about climate and carbon. But of course, there's nitrogen use efficiency, water quality, etc. Feed efficiency, so input versus output, but really it's a profitable input. So we're talking about maximizing the utilization of grazed grass in the dairy cow's diet. Milk, you might look at milk and say, well, why am I talking about milk? Milk is already inside the index. I've shown you that 30% emphasis, but it's 3 or 5 day yields. What about lactation persistency? We're hearing a lot about this from a milk processor perspective into the future. And I talk about quality. We have fat and protein, but what about the more detailed, more granular measures of quality? Fatty acid profiles or the nutritive value. And I believe that's going to be a major challenge in the next few years, is the nutritive quality and quantity within dairy products. Meat, that's both meat yield and meat quality. And then finally, and Jim alluded to this, animal health and disease, going to become more and more important. So when did we decide to include these traits in an index? Well, they have to conform to 3 criteria. Firstly, they must be important. And while this was traditionally economic importance, it now has to branch out to be more environmentally important and socially important. But I think if you look at my last slide, there's nobody who would disagree that those traits are not important. So that's a given. And the next part of my talk, I'm going to talk about, is there genetic differences between our animals? And then secondly, can we measure it in sufficient quantities that we can drive a breeding program? So very quickly, let's just look at some data from the next generation herd in Moore Park. These are cows, black and white cows, that are all fed exactly the same and managed exactly the same, side by side. So any differences that we would see, we can attribute to genetic differences. I'm just giving you very quick examples. One is saturated fat content and the other is casein content. So what we see is a distribution. On the left-hand side, they're the cows that are producing around 58% of their fat is saturated, while on the right-hand side, it's up to almost around 70%, which would kind of be the norm for indoor feeding systems. They're all managed the same, so there's massive differences between these animals, which are attributable to genetics. Down below that is also casein. And of course now, this is an exclusive first, nobody has seen this data. This is Ben Lahart's data in, again, the next generation herd, where he has actually measured methane emissions for the whole lactation of dairy cows. What we're seeing, look at the difference. There's a difference of around 200 grams of methane per day on the left-hand side, and cows managed exactly the same on the right-hand side, producing almost double the amount of methane. Massive differences between those animals. And I told you that this is the next generation herd, which is the elite animals in Ireland, elite black and whites versus the national average. So I've just colored them differently. The blue is the national average and the red is the elites. And you can see that from an elite perspective, they tend to be higher in saturated fat. They also tend to be higher in casein content. But Ben's data shows actually no difference in methane output per day between the 2 genotypes. But because the elite animals produce more milk solids, they are more carbon efficient. And we're seeing this as well. If we look at the efficiency of our dairy cows over the past 20 years since the introduction of the EBI, our cows are now 14% more carbon efficient at producing milk than what they were 20 years ago. Just out of interest, because we have the data, I've also shown you the methane emissions of our Jersey animals, which on average would be lower because on average they would be a lighter type of animal with lower feed intake. So that was the genetic variability. Hopefully you took from that there's massive potential there to breed for these animals. The next question is about the cost. We need to generate sufficient quantities of data that will enable us to identify the genetically elite from the genetically inferior. So back of the envelope calculations, if we look at how much does it cost to do real detailed measures of milk quality, you can see it's not cheap. Similarly, for methane measurements, to measure methane on an animal throughout lactation costs over 500 euros, the same for feed intake, a little bit less for meat eating quality. So these are not cheap things that we can easily implement to drive a breeding program from. However, what we're actively looking at in very advanced research is the real beauty of dairying, of course, is that because you milk the cows on average around twice per day, you're getting access to this biological sample of this animal, and it tells you a huge amount of what's going on inside in that animal. So can we predict things like feed intake, energy balance, methane emissions, efficiencies, etc., using this type of technology, which has already been used to determine the fat and protein content? So just to summarize, the economic breeding index and the dairy beef index are constantly reviewed, like every index around the world. So from a review perspective, we're talking about new traits, improving the genetic evaluations, and also altering the relative emphasis. And this goes back again to Frank and Liam's point about breeding. It is a proven strategy, and you build on it. It's cumulative. You accumulate your benefits year on year. So it is permanent. It is essentially free because you have to put the cows in calf. So as I said, you may as well put them in calf to a good bull as a bad bull. And also this whole issue of penetrance or uptake. It's essentially 100% uptake. Everybody will be using this technology. Yes, there might be a lag of a few years from farmers using maybe stock bulls as opposed to AI bulls, but those stock bulls are sired by AI bulls. So I'm very much thinking of a glass half full perspective when we talk about these challenges that are facing us from a breeding perspective.
Thank you, Donagh. I think a great point that you make there, you might as well use a good bull as a bad bull when you're breeding your animals. Now we turn our attention to sex semen. If we consider there has been a steady rise and uptake in the usage of sex semen in the last number of years, we hear now from Stephen and Butler about what are the implications as that is set to rise with a sex semen lab now established in Ireland.
Thanks, Emma Louise. So just to follow on from Donagh, it's clear that the EBI has delivered a lot for the Irish dairy industry. When you're picking your bulls to use in your herd, you're using a bull that you want to get replacement heifers from, right? So you want replacement heifers from these bulls. One of the side effects of conventional semen usage is you get roughly the same number of male dairy calves as you're going to get female dairy calves. So sex semen is a new technology that allows you to specifically target which bulls you want to use, which dams you want to use it on, and maximize your chance of getting female replacement calves. So first of all, I want to touch on the results of some studies we've done in recent years. So the first one was in 2018. In this study, all the cows were inseminated after observed heat. So it was up to the herd owner to identify the timing of AI, and neither the herd owner nor the AI technician knew which straws were sexed and which straws were conventional. So this was a blinded trial, and you can see that the pregnancy per AI here was greater for the conventional semen, 60%, compared with sex semen, 50%. We often talk about the relative performance of sex semen compared to conventional, and when we look at that, we're talking about roughly 84% as good. Now within that, again, there was huge variation, some herds doing exceptionally well with sex semen, and some herds doing quite poor with sex semen. So we wanted to look a bit more into maybe some of the reasons for that. And in a follow-up trial in 2019, we looked at questions around the timing of AI. So in 2019, we did a fixed time AI trial, and I think a lot of you will be familiar with fixed time AI protocols, but just for those that aren't, it's a 10-day protocol. So you start treating a cow 10 days before the AI date. And on the evening before AI, there's an injection of GnRH. And that injection of GnRH is to stimulate ovulation. It controls the timing of ovulation. So in this trial, we had 2 timings of AI and 3 different treatments. So 1/3 of the cows got inseminated with conventional semen at 16 hours after GnRH. Another third of the cows got inseminated with sex semen 16 hours after GnRH. And another third of cows got inseminated with sex semen 22 hours after GnRH. Now, 16 hours after GnRH, you have to interpret that as being the same as 16 hours after heat onset. So none of the cows in this study were inseminated early after heat onset. They were all late or extremely late for the 22-hour group. And again, you can see with that fixed time AI study, 61% of cows going in calf with conventional semen, and we're between 49 and 51% for the 2 sex semen treatments. So no real difference between those 2 different timings of AI, slight benefit for the very delayed. But again, there was huge variation between herds, and I'm just going to home in on that in this following slide. Again, in the relative pregnancy rates, between 80 and 84% for the 2 timed AI treatments. But the herd variation was interesting here. In that study, we had 24 herds, and I've divided them up here into groups of 8. So it's 3 groups of 8 based on how they performed on relative pregnancy rate. How good was the sex semen pregnancy rate compared to conventional? So on the left, we've got the best 8 herds. And on average, you can see that their relative pregnancy rate was 100%. Now that means that the sex semen pregnancy rate was equal to the conventional semen pregnancy rate. So as a group of 8 herds, these are all very happy. Sex semen performance was excellent. In the middle, we've got the intermediate 8 herds, where the relative pregnancy per AI was 84%, probably what those herds thought would happen when they entered into the trial. But on the right, we've got the problem herds. So these are 8 herds where the relative pregnancy rate for sex semen was only 67%. So sex semen was only 2/3 as good as conventional semen. And on the extreme right, you'll see some individual herds where it was only half as good. Important to note here that for those poorest 8 herds for relative pregnancy rate, the conception rates or the pregnancy rates for conventional semen were amongst the best. So the cows in those herds were fertile, the synchronization protocol was implemented correctly, and the timing of AI had to be approximately correct. Equally, the sex semen used on the herds on the right was identical to the sex semen that was used in the herds on the left. So we had high fertility sex semen product available for the study. And it just underlines the point here that it's really critical that you must get everything right on the day of AI. So there's a lot of more attention to detail is required for straw handling, insemination technique, number of straws being thawed. These are all much more critical for sex semen than they are for conventional. I'm not going to go into the guidelines here, but in the proceedings for this conference, there is specific details on the how to handle sex semen straws and how to use it correctly. And those will be available on the Teagasc website. So we're looking at a stage where we're thinking about changing the herd breeding strategy. And I've got 3 different types of semen straws that are being allocated to cows here. We've got conventional dairy semen, we've got conventional beef semen, and we've got sex dairy semen. This is the status quo here in Ireland at the moment. Typically, most heifers will get 1 shot of AI with conventional dairy semen, and almost all the cows in the herd are eligible for conventional dairy semen as well. Maybe there's some cows you definitely don't want replacements from, and from day 1 of the breeding season, they're allocated for beef semen. And then as we progress through the breeding season, the heifers after the first round of AI are probably running with a beef bull, so that's beef from week 4 onwards. And as we progress through, there's more and more beef semen being used through the breeding season. So that's the status quo in Ireland, and that gives us our current calf crop. So if we look at it nationally, we typically have about 27% of the calves are female dairy calves. And because it's mostly with conventional dairy semen, we've got an equivalent number of male dairy calves. And roughly 46% of the calves are beef cross. So you can see the female dairy calves are valuable. The beef cross calves are readily marketable and easy to move off farm. And the problem here is the 27% male dairy calves. If we were to move to using sex semen to generate the replacements, the first protocol would be to use sex semen on the heifers, but you still will need to identify cows that you want to use sex semen on because you will require more replacements than 1 round of AI and the heifers will deliver. And it does mean that from day 1 of the breeding season, you are identifying cows that will only get beef semen. These are cows you don't want replacements from. And of course, as you move through the breeding season, you're shutting down the dairy semen usage and you're moving to beef semen usage from week 4 onwards. And that has many management advantages as well for you as dairy farmers. But here we're just talking about the calf crop. And the implications for the calf crop, you can still get that 27% female dairy calves. That's just a simple question of how many sex semen straws you want to use. But if you use sex semen to generate the replacements, the male dairy calf is now down to 3%. And of course, we have a corresponding increase in the percentage of beef cross calves now up to 70%. And that's a much more sustainable, progressive picture for the dairy industry. Another thing to think about is the potential to accelerate genetic gain. On this slide here, I'm showing you the national figures for EBI gain over the last decade, which is very similar to the figures that Jim would have showed during his talk. And you can see that on average in 2020, the EBI was 126 euros. Now, that's primarily relying on conventional dairy semen usage. And if we were to move to sex semen, how would we go about allocating that? So here we've got this bell-shaped curve, and on the extreme left of this, we have our animals with the very poorest EBI, and on the extreme right, we have the animals with the very best EBI. And you can see most of your animals are somewhere around about the middle. In terms of allocating semen usage, we'll be identifying the best stems, so maybe the top half based on EBI to get high EBI sex semen. And that means all the bottom half here that they're good cows, you want to keep them in the herd, but now you want to get them pregnant with high DBI beef semen. The implications of being able to apply dam side selection pressure, in addition to picking the best bulls, if you're also picking the best dams, it's about a 15% per year increase in genetic gain. So you'd see now that if that had been happening over the last decade, we'd be at an EBI of 143. That's a 17 euro difference in herd average. For every euro of EBI, you get 2 euros of actual economic gain. Across a 100 cow herd, that's 3,400 euros. So that's effectively covering the entire cost of the sex semen usage in economic benefits from genetic gain. So to conclude, Sexing Technologies have opened a lab here in Moorpark, started sorted semen in November 2021. And by the spring of 2022 breeding season, that lab will have produced 75,000 straws of Sex Ultra 4M. And the objective here is just to kickstart greater availability and usage of sex semen. So more bulls, better bulls, and making it more attractive for farmers to use. Sex semen is a key technology for the Irish dairy industry. It is a fragile product, and it's something that you really need to get hardwired into your brain, that sex semen is a fragile product and it needs to be very carefully handled on the day of AI. It will deliver fewer male dairy calves. The EBI replacement heifers will be better. The remaining calf crop will be better DBI non-replacements, both male and female. And this is a much more sustainable picture for the Irish dairy industry. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Emma Louise.
Thank you, Stephen. Some really interesting information there, particularly how you can really target your best cows to produce superior heifers, which will be the future of your dairy farm. Looking then to the dairy beef side of things, over to Nicky Byrne to hear how we can excel in the type of animal that we're breeding as a non-replacement animal.
Thanks, Emma Louise. Today's talk is going to focus on the role that high beef merit animals can play in meeting our emission reduction targets that the director outlined earlier, and also how high merit beef animals can help maximise the value that we get from the other technologies highlighted by Stephen, such as Semen, as well as how can dairy beef help in our efforts to achieve the rate of genetic gain within our cow herd. And also, we're going to look at the potential that exists within every farm to improve our emphasis on dairy beef, and also the capabilities of dairy beef as a standalone system, and how combined efforts on both sides will help achieve a better outcome in terms of environmental and societal sustainability for Irish agriculture. So just to look at, the national dairy beef herd in terms of numbers, we know that on an annual basis, about 1.1 million calves that are non-replacing are born from our dairy herd every year. And when we look at these calves, under the age of 6 weeks of age and where they end up within our systems, we know that a third of them remain on the farms that they're born on. Another third of them are traded farm to farm and enter into our typical dairy beef systems. And the final thirds, they're highlighted here as in grey, and they're very much a grey area. And those are the number of calves that are exported into early slaughtering systems or are lost through mortalities. And this is really the third of calves that we must focus on and really focus on improving their beef merits to make them more attractive for domestic demand, as some of these outlets are quite volatile year on year in terms of the number of the calves that they absorb. But we must focus on making these calves more attractive to enter into our dairy beef systems. And when we look at our dairy beef farms and the structure of that sector, we know that there's only about 10,000 farms who purchase and rear calves on farm annually, but the relatively small numbers of calves that they are purchasing, 37 calves per farm. So there is scope within those farms to increase the number of calves. However, there's a massive challenge on those farms in terms of profitability. And when we look at the attrition rate in the number of farmers who remain implementing calf to beef systems, we can see over a 5-year period that only 39% of dairy beef farmers continued purchasing calves in year 5 of that cycle. So that is one of the major challenges that as dairy farmers we must try to understand and put steps in place on each of our farms to try and improve and reduce the risks associated with the purchase of calves on these farms. And I suppose some of the challenges they're probably experienced at the moment, but going forward into the future with increased numbers, we could see further challenges in these areas. And on dairy farms, if we see reduced demand for our beef calves, it's going to add to extra rearing costs on our farms if we have an increased residency time of those calves. And typically, predominantly spring calving systems, the workload is high enough as it is. So if we've those calves on farms for longer periods of time than they need to be because of poor carcass merit or poor potential, that is going to add to the workload. And obviously, if we've increased numbers of calves on farms, it's going to add to the pressure that's there on our resources, such as calf housing. And there can be negative implications in terms of calf health, which could possibly affect our replacement calf crop. And also going forward, if we are faced with keeping these calves because of poor carcass merit on farm for a longer period of time, that is ultimately going to reduce the stocking capacity of our farms. And on the beef side, obviously, we've touched on some of these challenges. I suppose the big one is a profitability challenge. And that profitability challenge stems predominantly from calves of reducing carcass performance. And that reducing carcass performance is coming at a very, very high age at slaughter, which is typically about 26 to 28 months on our farms. So we know that there's massive scope to reduce that if we get higher calf quality, better management, better health. And ultimately, inefficiency at the different stages, through poor calf quality and other factors is adding to increased cost of production on our farms and ultimately reducing that profitability of the system and leading to that high attrition rate that we see. So we really need to, focus on these challenges and use these to inform our breeding decisions on our farms. But look, there's massive potential from dairy beef for both the dairy farmer as well as the beef farmer and combined for Irish agriculture. And by improving our emphasis on the sires that we select for use on the dairy herd, if we have a better quality calf, we can increase the demand, and as Jim touched on earlier, focus on improving the saleability of that calf. And when we talk about saleability, we talk about ensuring that we repeat custom year on year and that we can guarantee that our calves are going to move off farm in a timely fashion and really optimize our farm system. So increased demand is a massive positive. But also one that's hard to put an economic value on is the social acceptance of an improved dairy beef policy. And we produce top quality products in terms of our milk and meat. And by implementing, an improved dairy beef breeding policy, we're really, really, galvanizing that good image that we have and producing, a very positive product from a very positive system. So dairy beef is going to be central to improving the social acceptance of Irish dairy production. And I suppose in systems, where we're focused on genetic gain within the cow herd, dairy beef is playing a central role in helping implement a high level of selection intensity and really fast track that genetic gain. And on the beef side, if we see an improved emphasis on dairy beef production, and one of the most important things in this emphasis is that it's at an early stage in the breeding season. So we end up with high numbers of high merit calves from the beginning of the calving season, because we all know that there's a distinct advantage of the earlier born calf and their ability to convert and utilize grazed grass during that first grazing season, the same as an early calving cow. So really, if dairy beef farmers can get increased numbers of high merit calves from early on in the calving season, that is going to be a massive positive for their system. And if we can get a higher proportion of beef cross calves rather than lower merit dairy calves, that's going to bring greater efficiency in terms of feed, age at slaughter, and ultimately carcass potential. And I suppose looking at it on a larger scale, an improved emphasis on dairy beef will maintain and further improve the quality of the product that we produce from Irish beef. And I suppose combine those benefits, really enhance the sustainability of Irish agriculture, and they're across multiple pillars: economic, environmental, and social. But I suppose we have a few decisions to make in our improved dairy beef breeding policy. I suppose the bull, Donagh alluded to the bull selection and some of the tools that are available there. Stephen also highlighted, those cows that he's identifying to generate the next generation of replacements from. So obviously the remainder of those are going to be submitted to a beef straw. But also the timing, when we use the beef straw, what bull we use, and what cow we put them on. A combination of those decisions is very important in determining the quality and potential of that non-replacing calf crop. And the Dairy Beef Index is going to be massively important. It now gives us a breeding objective to generate and produce high quality sires for use on the dairy herd going forward, as well as for the farmer in choosing to select the bull. And I suppose it's made up of two different sub-indexes. We have our calving sub-index, which contributes to 50% of the overall index, as well as our beef sub-index. I suppose the relative emphasis that farmers place in some of these sub-indices is dependent on the cow, that cow's calving ability. What parity is that cow? Is she going to be retained within the herd? And I suppose the time of year, certain traits are more important at certain time points, early on in the breeding season, on a cow that, isn't generating future replacements or is moving on in lactation number, they can be probably submitted to a longer gestation sire because you may not be as sensitive to that early on in the season. I suppose Donagh made the point that, you know, when using a bull, you might as well use a good bull because it doesn't cost you any more. And I suppose what we've historically probably seen when using you know, we see farmers using a beef bull just because he's a beef bull. But the point, you know, needs to be made here as well that when using a beef bull, you must use a high merit beef bull, especially when we talk about 70% of the calf crop being of beef cross. But if we look at the table in front of us, looking at Angus and Holstein Friesian sires from the respective active bull lists, we can see that there's an overlap in terms of their carcass potential. So if we continue to put very little emphasis on the carcass traits of our beef sires that we're using on the dairy herd, we're probably not going to maximize the response that we can get from the beef sires because of you know, low carcass potential from some of those animals. You know, we really do need to be focusing on the higher end of the scale in terms of carcass metrics, but also taking note of the gestation and calving levels of these animals, because we don't want to, you know, impact on the efficiencies, the reproductive efficiencies of our cow herd, which Jim highlighted are of utmost importance to his farm business. But I suppose the Dairy Beef Index allows the identification of outliers that offer the best balance of these traits for both parties involved, the dairy farmer as well as the dairy beef farmer. And I suppose just to put some, you know, real time and real life data to it, here on the table and pictured in the background are cattle that make up a study that we are running at Teagasc Grange. And in this study, we assembled animals of divergent genetic merit for the age at which they'll produce an on-spec carcass in terms of carcass weight and carcass conformation. We didn't use DBI or any of the sub-indices as selection criteria, but when we assigned those to the two different cohorts of animals that we have on the table, you know, we can see that although they have a very similar dairy beef index, the contribution of the calving and the beef sub-indices differ greatly for the two groups of animals. You know, so they're probably two extremes in terms of their suitability for use on the dairy herd. And when we look at the beef sub-index especially, we can see that 75% of the overall index from the early group is coming from the beef sub-index. That's in contrast to 25% on the later group at the bottom of the table. But that difference in beef sub-index, when we see it come through at slaughter and what it translates into, is nearly a 40 kilo carcass weight difference in this group of animal. And that 40 kilos of carcass weight difference, you know, is coming at the cost of, you know, maybe 1.5% extra calving difficulty and a day extra in gestation length. And, you know, that might be too much in certain circumstances. However, on certain cows, mature cows with very good calving ability that may not be sensitive to extra days gestation, you know, it's a very, very small price to pay for that injection of efficiency in terms of carcass metrics. But most importantly, we assembled and assessed these animals in a grass-based system, you know, utilizing 85 to 90% of their lifetime feed requirement coming from homegrown, grazed and conserved forage, and still achieved, you know, a slaughter age of just over 20 months and a carcass weight of 300 kilos from those elite animals for a very, very small price. And we'll see these animals in the concluding video. And just for yourselves to take note of the variation that exists amongst those animals, there's also high EBI animals within that group from the top 4 bulls. However, although they were managed the same as the animals on the table, none of those animals were fit for slaughter and will result in a higher age at slaughter with increased levels of imported concentrate into their diet. And that is the real difference between our pure dairy genetics and our beef cross genetics, and it really will enforce the importance of utilizing high beef genetics on your herd. So just to conclude, dairy beef, you know, is a very, very important tool in future-proofing the Irish dairy sector. And dairy beef will also make a massive contribution to future-proofing Irish beef production. But the use of high-quality genetics is central to the future-proofing of this. And I suppose high-merit beef genetics, they're a very low-cost and a proven technology to improve sustainability. And it can be used, in farms. Come next spring, every farm can avail this technology. There's no delay or lag in it, and we can start making improvements straight away. And so each herd, irrespective of cow type, production system, each herd has opportunity to add further value at no additional cost. And it will probably actually save and complement other technologies on your farm and really maximize farm efficiency. But I suppose, looking at the video at the end, ask yourselves, what do dairy beef systems need? And what steps can I improve on your farm to help reduce and mitigate the challenges that dairy beef farmers face? And just in the video, you'll see some cattle from an age at slaughter system study at Teagasc Grange, and you'll see the variation that exists. But dairy beef is a very capable system, but with your help, we can really future-proof it and maximize its impact for Irish agriculture in enhancing its sustainability.
I think it's fair to say, Nicky, there are a proportion of cows in every herd that are suitable for dairy beef as you see it. Lots of questions have come through, so we'll throw the ball straight in and we'll come to you, Jim. Is your calving rate improvements driven by new heifers coming into the herd in a post-quota era?
Yeah, it's the group average, and I think our group average replacement rate is 22% stabilized now. So that's a key figure that we would look at. And you don't want it too high or you don't want it too low. So I don't think it is our 6-week calving rate isn't over influenced by that. I think it's a figure that we have to look in at, and people can easily say, oh, they're bringing loads of heifers in and a high proportion of them to get the 6-week calving rate. But we would drill into those figures every year, and it's a figure that you have to get right. As I said, you have to have a balance on it, like everything in life, and too high you're in trouble, too low. So knows the 6-week isn't being driven by that, in my opinion, no.
And I suppose fair to say that your herd numbers have stabilised. There was significant increases since 2015, but you are at a stable number now in terms of the cows you carry.
Yes, like the stocking rate, interestingly, has stayed the exact same in the 10 years. I think it went from a 2.39 overall stocking rate to a 2.59 now. So there hasn't, so the acres are there for the cows. So the numbers now are going to all the words being mentioned today is stabilization of the herd. And I see the same in our group. And I suppose it's stabilization with better is the key. And one thing we've done in the group is the DNA testing of some of our animals, the younger ones, and that's bringing a great gain that we hope to build on in the future as well.
And sticking with the 6-week calving rate, a follow-on question: as the herds mature, the calving rate, as herds mature, calving rate tends to decrease. There's less heifers coming into the herd. Would you see 6-week in-calf rate as a better KPI for measuring the herd's fertility?
6-week in-calf, yes, that would be something that we would be looking at. Again, as the herds improve through DNA is going to be a big part, I think, in herd improvement as we go forward. And the stabilization of the herd is going to change an awful lot of things, as I was thinking of it when the lads were given their slides there today. So that's going to be a big thing we will have to be looking at in the future.
And to you, Donagh, from a UK farmer listening in today, are all the genes needed to improve further within Ireland and the EBI system, or is there a need to look at more to North America and Europe to improve udder health and total solids further?
Yeah, good question, Emma Louise. I think there's always a potential benefit of investigating further genetics. Like Oman is a great example, right? A North American bull brought in 7-8 years ago, added massively to the Irish population. A lot of people said he couldn't deliver. He was North American, he didn't have the genes, but quite clearly has proven that he can deliver. But for sure, like genetic diversity, Joe, a few questions have been thrown at me of late about the relatedness of the top bulls, that they're very highly related, and what's the impact of that. Well, I would equate inbreeding to kind of like inflation in an economy, right? If your inflation is low in your economy, it's probably not doing great. So if your inbreeding increase is low, you're probably not doing great as a breeding program. Now, if your inflation is too high, or if your inbreeding is too high, you're probably going to blow up at some stage. So it's trying to find that nice intermediate medium. And like using OGI as an example, Oman as an example, however, 7-8 years ago, 23 of the top bulls in the active bull list were Oman's sons, and the 24th one was Oman himself. And the sky was falling in. There was a huge problem. Now where's Oman, right? So the other thing the farmers say a lot to me is, geez, the bull I chose last year, he's gone off the list. That's brilliant, because that means we're achieving genetic gain, and new families lines are coming on year on year, and like that's crucially important. So yes, look, genetic diversity is the key driver of genetic gain, and wherever that diversity is, be it another breed even, right? Massive potential there in the other breeds as well.
Another question for you, Donagh, and very topical at the moment. I'm afraid the new nitrates bans contradict EBI, compact calving, and efficiency in general. A well-managed high EBI herd will produce over 6,300 litres.
Yeah, look, how much milk the animal produces, I think, is a function of genetics and nutrition. But at the end of the day, and Jim, you alluded to, really, it's at a solids perspective. And what the EBI is trying to do, Emma Louise, is it has this negative weight on kilos of water, essentially, and has a positive weighting on the fat and the protein. So really what it's doing is increasing the composition. And we see this quite clearly when we look at the co-op reports over time. Like, remember, Jim, you'll remember back the protein 350 from Kerry. Like, I don't know what our statistics are now, but I think it's over 350 at a national level. Like, we've had massive gains, not on kilos of milk, but on actual kilos of solids. And you mentioned that, what were your figures earlier on, as a discussion could be increased by?
115 kgs of milk solids in a 10-year period.
Any idea what your kilos of milk went up?
Kilos of milk, I haven't that off the top of my head now, kilos of milk.
But it was predominantly driven probably by the percentages, rather than the yield.
I think it was, yeah.
And that's what the EBI is trying to do, Emma Louise, yeah.
And before we move on from you, Donagh, the jerseys are emitting less methane. Is this the way to go, given there is little difference in production?
You know where I stand now, Emma Louise, from a breed perspective, and it goes back to your very first point. Look, some breeds, some sires are suited to some systems, and some aren't. Like I showed you that on average, the jerseys were at the left-hand side of that distribution, but they were only a fraction of it. There was some black and whites there right below them, doing exactly the same thing. So it's just a matter of what is the right bull for your system, right? And so happens, maybe it's a Jersey bull, maybe it's a Norwegian red bull, maybe it's a black and white bull. To me, breed is largely irrelevant. Is the sire suited for your system and your breeding goal within your herd?
And I think that is exactly what Jim alluded to from their discussion group. The breed is irrelevant. It's the traits that are going to deliver. Moving to you, Stephen, if sex semen is going to be the way forward, should there be a program put in place where a selection of high EBI herds are used to provide heifers for the national herd, and the lower EBI herds are encouraged to use beef AI until a higher EBI is achieved in their herds?
It's an option. If a high EBI herd has an ability to throw off a lot of surplus heifers, then if there's farmers there that are interested in purchasing them, and going down the route of breeding all their animals to beef semen and taking advantage of the marketability of those beef cross calves, then certainly it's an option. I mean, we're not at that stage yet. The sex semen from the best bulls needs to be available and widely used before there'll be that surplus of high BI heifers available. So we're at that stage now where it could become an option in the coming years.
And if you consider somebody who's listening in today and they're not 100% happy with where their EBI is at, and they see maybe somebody in their discussion group, or they see advertisements for a large number of these surplus heifers from farms, calving early, how would they go about implementing such a system?
How would they go about generating high BI heifers of their own?
No, from others. Is it as simple as selecting out herds and bringing them in?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously bringing in animals needs to be done in a biosecure manner. You need to be making sure you're purchasing in animals from a clean herd, but it's like the EBI is like a price tag on a what you're getting, right? So if it's a high BI herd and the replacements have a high BI value, better again if they're genomic tested, you know what you're getting, right? So there's a value associated with that. Lots of herds are in the system now of generating surplus heifers and selling those onto the market every year. How would they go about doing it? I mean, I don't follow where the markets are for these, but Jim, you might like to comment. What's the current setup in your group for surplus heifers?
Surplus heifers have been a big thing for our group over the years, but I do think, and I saw this autumn, I do think there's a bigger gap opening up in the market. As you said, Stephen, high EBI, DNA tested, carbon. So anyone that's in the marketplace wants all the boxes ticked now. So I think it's a specialized market in the future, I think.
And to you, Nicky, is there a willingness for the dairy industry to support the rearing of dairy bull calves from a financial perspective going forward, as it is seen as a low profit system for beef farmers?
Yeah, I suppose, look, the various projects may be looking at that, but I think if you really want to support the rearing of calves, I think a greater emphasis on the sires that you are using is the first stop shop. We're running dairy beef systems in Teagasc Grange, grass-based, same principles as your model dairy system. We're running those principles on a beef system, and we can see that that's a high output, nearly 1,000 kilos of carcass output. And, even at low beef prices, we're capable of generating a margin on those. But if we got, better merit animals that were more efficient in terms of the feed they eat and for the number of days that they're eating it, I think, focus on that, get the basics right, as we talked about basics earlier, get them right before, we start looking at alternative systems. However, for the poorest quality animals, I suppose maybe in that Jersey cross scenario, it may be an option that may have to be explored in those scenarios. But typically, high beef merit calves, there's a market out there for them. Farmers are willing to buy them if they can get them born early enough, get a big intake of them at an early stage, get their vaccination protocols implemented on a big group of calves early on in the season, and be finished with buying and minimise the number of sources. That's what dairy beef specialists are looking for. And we I think we can do a lot to tick those boxes.
And a follow-on question there, you would have talked about, those early born calves. Another question has come in here. Can late born calves, so your April or May born calves, leave a profit for beef farmers? Is there any work that you have completed on profitability of those type of calves?
Yeah, so I suppose what we see with those later born calves is that they probably fit into a different system. And it's probably the shift from that kind of under 24-month type system that we can achieve, efficiently with that earlier born animal. What we see with those late, maybe April born animals, is that they drift off and go out and are slipping into systems that are finishing from a third grazing season. And really, you know, that's probably the optimum for that animal based on their potential. However, it's not the optimum in terms of climate efficiency, you know, in a lot of scenarios.
To you, Donagh, less cows and more milk is the obvious way forward, in my view. A comment from a listener here today. When we're looking at moving towards lower methane emissions, what's your view on that?
To me, it's more profit. It's not about milk, it's about profitability. And Jim quite elegantly put it about his 6-week calving rate was the main driver of profitability in his system. From a climate perspective, it's exactly the same thing.
To you, Stephen, is there a worry that if sex semen was increased across the national herd, we would see a reduction in the genetic diversity of the AI bulls available?
Yeah, so remember now, most farmers are using dairy semen to generate female replacements, right? Most of those male calves end up as, you know, their veal, their beef, their own genetics are never expressed. But if you went to a situation where you have large uptake of sex semen, let's say 400,000 straws per annum being used, generating most of the replacement requirements, there will be fewer male dairy calves. And from a breeding perspective, there will need to be additional efforts put in to generate the next generation of AI bulls. And, you know, we're doing research on that at the moment, you know, use of new IVF technologies and combining that with sex semen. So if you're making those embryos, you could use male sorted semen to make sure that all the calves born were bull calves. It's just an additional step that will be required, but we're nowhere near that stage at the moment. But certainly the technologies are there to mitigate against that risk.
I'm going to stick with you for a minute, Stephen. If you've never used sex semen before, what group of cows or heifers should you start with first?
Well, the most important thing is to pick high fertility dams. So the easiest one and the best fertility animals and the highest EBI animals in your herd are your heifers, right? So they're going to give you the best conception rates. They're the highest EBI. They're the animals you most want replacements from. And after that, then into your lactating cow herd, it's the younger animals. Again, they're on average going to be the higher EBI. The bigger the days in milk you can put. So younger animals meaning less than parity 1 to 4, at least 50 days in milk on the day you're inseminating them, good body condition score, and free of postpartum problems. If you can tick all those boxes, those are good candidates for using sex semen on.
And Jim, we might hear from you. You've used sex semen.
Yeah, and in our group, a lot of our members have used sex semen. Caution is the big word to start off with. Everything has to be right, and the cow is in your control. So you pick your cow right, and you handle all the procedures with the AI. It's vital that the technician and the straw is handled correctly. So every cow won't be suited for it. And, you know, that brings on to Nicky. Like, Nicky needs to pick up with the beef, the dairy beef straw maybe in conjunction with the sex semen one. And up to now, I think a lot of our members in our group would have used conventional with sex semen, but to convince us to move to sexed and dairy beef straws with it, you know, we need to be sure about the gestation length, calving difficulty, because, you know, and hopefully that the lads in future will be able to tick those ones for us.
And you know what you're saying, it is the concern of the dairy farmer. The cow is going to be in calf for longer, or she will have she will have a hard calving,
Yeah.
and that would lead to a longer time frame between calving and breeding. To you, Jim, you know, you've stabilized your cow numbers. You're fairly comfortable where you're at now. Will you continue to produce surplus heifers every year for sale, or will you revert to the dairy beef?
I think it'll be a little bit of both. I think a lot of our group have the potential to sell surplus. I think our group has a high enough EBI and will have a market, but it will be more specialized. I think it will, like the late calving heifers won't be sellers. They won't be saleable. They might be tricky sell. It might be easier sell the dairy beef that Nicky is proposing. So I think it'll be the group as a whole will have surplus to sell, but it will be more specialized, and there will be a place for the dairy beef if we can tick those little items that are of concern at the moment. If we get that, if the lads have them right, I think we can have a little bit of dairy beef in as well, to have every calf saleable. And for a dairy farmer next spring and every spring, you know, you have the amount of calves you're going to keep, but you need to get the other ones away sold early. And the way to sell them early is have someone coming in quickly for them.
And Stephen, back to you in relation to the practicalities of sex semen. do you have to use a synchronization protocol in order to use sex semen, or can you use natural service?
For sure, either is an option. You can inseminate based on observed heats. It does require more attention. I mean, Jim talked about the importance of attention to detail, and if it's at observed heat, then you need to be having a better understanding of where that cow is in relation to heat onset than if you're synchronizing animals. So, you know, with conventional semen, anywhere from 8 to 20 hours after heat onset is going to be an okay time for conventional semen. But with sex semen, inseminating anyway too early at all is bad news. I talked about this with the slides, that it's a damaged product, and part of that implication of that is that these sperm cells will not survive as long in the reproductive tract as conventional semen. So if they only survive for 12 hours, you want to delay the timing of insemination to try and make sure there's viable sperm roughly the same time as the egg is released. Okay, so that's for observed heat. You need to be inseminating 14 to 20 hours after heat onset. Synchronization, you're less concerned about the timing of AI because you know that you're doing it at the right time. You're synchronizing ovulation, you know that you're inseminating at the right time. And it does mitigate some of the risk. One of the big advantages of synchronization is that you pick your animals you want to use it on. Cows, heifers, you pick them, you inseminate them on mating start date, and boom, you're done. If they don't go in calf, they repeat 21 days later, you actually get an improvement in your calving pattern having used sex semen than if you did no synchronization at all. It's a cost though. Synchronization is a cost. It's an additional cost. You gain it back next year with earlier calving, more days of milk and so on, but it's a cost today that you won't recoup for another 9 months. So either one is fine though. I mean, in terms of conception rates, I think we've 2 very large trials done. The conception rates were almost identical. It's just a matter of which system is right for your farm.
Nicky, sell it to us. We're a group of dairy farmers sitting here. Like, what are the real benefits to us calving dairy beef animals as opposed to dairy calves?
Yeah, so I suppose if we start at a very broad level, we talk about stabilized herd. If we want to maintain a stable herd in terms of cow numbers, be it ductler cows, dairy cows, whatever, if we can reduce the lifespan of the progeny from both of those groups of cows, that's going to go a long way in contributing to, maintaining cow numbers as well as reducing our emissions from our ruminants. So I think, dairy beef, has a major role there in contributing to livestock numbers. But I think Jim touched on it, very importantly. The objective is to produce a saleable calf. So a saleable calf has to be a high merit calf, a high quality calf, high health status calf. They're typically earlier born and they move off farm earlier. They'll move off farm, more reliably year on year. You'll get repeat custom. And from a dairy beef buyer's perspective, they want early born calves. They want them in sufficient quantities from a minimal number of sources. And typically what has filled that market requirement has been Holstein Friesian bull calves early on in the season. We see a lot of specialist dairy beef producers implementing that system for those reasons. So if we could replace those with high merit beef calves, I think it would bring massive efficiency to their system. And, we need a profitable dairy beef system to allow dairy prosper. So what's good for one is good for the other. And I think it's really important to work together, integrate the needs of both. And I think the dairy beef index is going to be a game changer in developing future sires. We may not be there yet, but I think we're going to get that sire that Jim can use, on the remainder of his herd that he's not breeding replacements from.
To you, Donagh, something we debate every year, a question in genomics or daughter proven, which is going to work best for my herd in the long run?
Yeah, so it's often asked, and I think the main point, Emma Louise, is it's not one or the other. It's the same. I get the same thing about crossbreeding. It's not one or the other. So you don't have to go all your herd genomics, all your herd daughter proven. It goes back to my original point: is what bull suits your system, right? Or importantly, what team of bulls suits your particular system, right? And if they are genomics, then well and good. And it's probably a mixture between genomics and daughter proven. But if we just look at the actual evidence in retrospect of what has happened over the past few years and the heifers that are actually calving, the daughters of the genomic bulls are €25 higher in EBI than those of the daughter proven, who in turn then are for €35 higher than stock bulls. So there is massive genetic potential there, and that's really just genetic lag. So like the proven bulls there are 6 years plus. The genomic bulls when their daughters are born are 3 years plus. We're increasing by around €10 per year. So it all completely stacks up. But again, and Jim, you might want to touch on it, it has to come back to bull teams. And even going back to that question about genetic diversity at the top and draw from the one bull family, etc. What worries me a little bit more about that is that if that family of bulls is a genomic bull, is a sire, and if he drops, then all the bulls drop. And that's the real important bit about bull teams. And using the sire advice, it accounts for the fact that all those bulls are from the same sire, who in himself is a genomic sire. So, yeah.
Yeah, Donagh, I think that maybe we should emphasize that in a big way, like our group, when we're picking our bulls, it's been drilled into us by our facilitator. It's a team selection. It's a team, and it'll be the same with the sex semen. You can't just depend on one or two bulls in a pick for sex semen. You must pick a team, and that has been stacked up in our group when we look back on our fertility results. When you look at I think it's down on F in the ICBF report, your in-calf rate from each particular bull. So it is vital that you pick a team. And just to Donagh, we might can we look forward next year to a greater selection of bulls from sex semen? Will we have a bigger, like up to now? The one little thing that was a discourage for sex semen was it wasn't the highest EBI bulls. So hopefully, can we look forward to a bigger selection for the 22 season on sex?
Yeah, so to be fair to AI companies, up until now, they've been relying on sending bulls abroad. And with sending bulls abroad is there's biosecurity aspects for them. So the bulls are in quarantine, they're not being collected. They go to the sorting lab in a foreign country, they're in quarantine, they're not being collected. So these best bulls would be not collected for a long period of time. Because of biosecurity, they would send a small team of bulls. Now, with a lab in the country, it's just the ejaculate that's coming to the lab. So the bull stays where he normally is, and he's on his regular collection schedule. So if all is right in the world, then the main barrier to having big teams of bulls and having the best bulls available are gone, right? So the expectation is that the best bulls will be available and a large team of bulls should be available.
Very good.
And to you, Stephen, just a follow-on question from our earlier question on synchronization. Will the hormones for synchronization continue to be available in the future?
Well, they're available now. The future is a hard one to predict, but I mean, these are approved veterinary medicines. They're available. They're available in most countries around the world. They are used. So we can only operate in the here and now. So right now, these are available medicines for use in animals.
So in the interest of time, I have a question just for Stephen and Jim, and I want a number. Stephen, for farmers who are considering using sex semen, what sort of fertility sub-index number should they have in their herd in order to use it?
Herd fertility sub-index number. That's more of a question for Donagh, I'd say. Where are we with the next gen herd? We're talking about 100, right? I mean, we're talking about 100 as a target for where your herd should get to. There's probably a few herds out there that are at that number, though, is there?
Yeah, but I think the point that two of you made was not just about genetics, it's about the management and stuff like that. So you might have all the best genetics in the world, but if you don't manage the semen right.
And two numbers now for you, Jim. Maintenance sub-index of your cows, what sort of an EBI figure are you looking at?
Well, the maintenance sub-index in our group as a whole, I think is 15, 16, somewhere around that. And that's it's a figure that you can beat yourself up about. But to me, it's the EBI. It's the EBI and the EBI gain that we get. Maintenance is a percentage of it, but it's not something. It's not something that I would. It's not a priority. It's the other ones are the big ones.
I think we could continue this conversation at length for at least another hour, and there are some questions that have gone unanswered. But in the interest of time, we will wrap it there. My thanks to our panel today, Jim, Donagh, Stephen, and Nicky, and also to you, our audience, for all of your questions and your contributions. It has really enriched our conversation today. The Dairy Edge. The National Dairy Conference will go live again tomorrow morning at the same time of 10 a.m. We will hear from the new head of Dairy KT, Joe Patton, where he will look at the environmental and the economic implications of our grass-based systems here in Ireland. We will also have a panel discussion with Stuart Childs moderating. He will be joined by dairy farmers Ger Pardy and Kevin Toomey, as well as Teagasc researchers Michael O'Donovan and Brian McCarthy, and they will look to grazing management and clover establishment. Thanks to all of those who have worked behind the scenes today. We have Declan McCardle and Padraig O'Connor on production, as well as Joe Patton and the dairy specialist team, in particular George Ramsbottom and Stuart Childs, who have been involved in organising this particular session. To reiterate, our thanks to you, our audience, for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you at the same time of 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.